When a gruesome homicide was reported in Eastmont, Georgia, every unit in the department was pulled in. The clock was ticking, and the goal was clear: find whoever did it before the trail went cold. But finding the killer wasn't easy. The list of suspects kept growing, from ex-lovers with history to neighbors with grudges, and even people no one expected to be connected at all. Each lead seemed promising until it fell apart, forcing investigators to start over again. Days turned into weeks, and still, the evidence didn't make sense. What really happened inside that house? Was it a confrontation gone wrong? A crime of passion? Or a carefully planned act disguised as an accident? Detectives were racing against time to solve a mystery that had the entire community watching, and wondering if this was justice in progress, or the perfect murder hiding in plain sight.
530, we're north on the alleyway, 53rd Street, Marty Mercy inside.
It all began in the early hours of March 17, 2023. Prior to that morning, there was absolutely nothing to suggest that a tragedy would strike one of the most peaceful neighborhoods in Eastmont, Georgia. Families were going about their day as usual. Children were off school for a teacher workday, and everything about that Friday morning felt normal. Inside one of those quiet homes, 34-year-old Danielle Pierce was getting ready for the day with her 2 kids. Her ex-husband, Calvin Brooks, had promised to stop by to fix the water heater. It was not out of romance, but out of responsibility as a father. For a while, everything seemed calm. The kids played in the living room while Calvin worked in the hallway closet. Danielle made coffee in the kitchen and checked her phone. 10 minutes later, a neighbor reported hearing a car door slam hard enough to echo across the street. The sound startled the family dog next door, setting off a brief chain of barking that stopped just as quickly as it began. Then, a black SUV was seen on security footage pulling into Danielle's driveway. The driver stepped out quickly, slamming the door with force. The figure moved with urgency toward the house, though what happened next would only be pieced together later, through witness statements and digital evidence. Neighbors told investigators they heard raised voices, at first muffled, then louder, followed by what sounded like something shattering. One caller to 911 described it as a crash, like a glass bowl or a picture frame hitting the floor. Another caller added, it sounded like yelling, then 2 loud bangs, close together, and then silence. Within minutes, Eastmont police units were dispatched to the address. Officers arrived at approximately 11:17 a.m. and immediately requested medical assistance. The first responders who entered the home found chaos. Objects scattered, a chair tipped over, and 2 children crying in the corner. Someone had been shot, and the scene showed no sign of forced entry. Detectives quickly realized this wasn't a random break-in. Everyone inside the home knew each other, but who pulled the trigger and why remained unclear. Neighbors watched from their porches as police cars filled the street. It didn't make sense, one resident later said. They were a quiet family. We'd never even heard an argument. Another added, I saw someone sitting outside on the steps, shaking. I couldn't tell who it was, but they looked in shock. Officers began securing the area, marking off the property with tape as paramedics rushed in. It all happened so fast that by the time word spread around the block, the cul-de-sac was already sealed off like a movie scene. Inside the house, detectives began noting every small detail. The smell of coffee still fresh, a phone buzzing unanswered on the counter, a half-finished repair near the water heater. Whatever had just occurred had done so within a span of minutes. The children, too young to fully understand, could only describe hearing shouting and then a loud boom. They couldn't say who had been yelling or what started it. Those gaps in time would later become the foundation of an investigation that stretched far beyond that neighborhood. By noon, backup units arrived from the County Homicide Division. Officers canvassed nearby houses, asking residents if they'd seen anyone leaving the scene. One neighbor recalled a tall man in dark clothing pacing outside before police came, though no one could confirm where he went. Another mentioned a red sedan that had driven past twice earlier that morning. Detectives kept every lead open. They couldn't afford to rule anything out. Not a domestic dispute, not an accident, not even the possibility that someone else entirely had entered the home. The media caught wind of the case before the afternoon was over. News vans parked at the end of the street as officers tried to hold the line between speculation and fact. By 3 p.m., social media was filled with rumors. Some claimed it was a burglary gone wrong. Others said it was an argument between partners, and a few believed it was an act of revenge. Police refused to comment publicly, releasing only a short statement. An individual has been fatally wounded in a residential incident. We are investigating all possibilities. Behind the scenes, investigators worked methodically, marking every spent shell casing, every footprint, and every timestamp. They knew that somewhere in the noise of panic lay the truth about what happened that morning. One life had been lost inside that home, but it was still unclear whose actions had led to it, or why. What they did know was that everyone involved had a connection to one another, and that meant the answer was hidden somewhere within the circle of people closest to Danielle Pierce. By sundown, what began as a quiet morning in Eastmont had turned into a homicide investigation that would grip the entire state. And within hours, detectives would begin to realize the truth wasn't hiding outside that house. It had been there all along. With the deceased body cleared, the evidence gathered, and every inch of the Pierce residence photographed, the investigation began in full motion. At that time, there was no clear suspect. Detectives only knew that several people had been inside that house when the shooting occurred, and one of them was Danielle Pierce. They needed to understand who she was, what her life looked like before this day, and what could have possibly led to a moment so devastating. On paper, Danielle seemed ordinary. A licensed nurse, mother of 2, and a woman who'd lived in Eastmont for almost 5 years. But the more detectives looked into her past, the more they found that beneath that quiet image was a woman who had spent years fighting for peace that never came easily. A year before the tragedy, Danielle had been married to Calvin Brooks. They met some years earlier through mutual friends at a community event in Atlanta. He was confident, charming, the type who always had the right answer, and she was drawn to his confidence. Friends recalled that he pursued her relentlessly. One of her co-workers told investigators later, he used to pick her up from work almost every day. He'd bring her lunch, send flowers. He was that kind of man. By 2015, they were engaged, and by summer 2016, they were married in a small church ceremony surrounded by family. For the first few years, it seemed like a solid marriage. Danielle worked nights at a local hospital while Calvin managed a small construction business. They had 2 children, and for a while, life was predictable, stable, and calm. But with time, the tone of their marriage began to shift. Friends and family said the first signs were subtle. Calvin's comments that seemed harmless at first, but slowly became cutting. At first, we all thought he was just blunt, one of her closest friends told police. But it turned into something else. She started saying things like, "I can't say that. Calvin will make a joke out of it." He wasn't physically violent, but his words began to sting. The verbal attacks worsened after she got a promotion in 2018. Calvin didn't congratulate her. Instead, he mocked her success, saying things like, "So now you think you're some big-shot nurse?" Arguments became routine. "You think you're better than me now?" he'd ask, according to one of Danielle's statements. "You're just a nurse, Danielle. Don't act like you run this house." Those words, simple but sharp, became daily reminders that her confidence was slowly being stripped away. By 2020, Danielle's friends began noticing her withdrawal. She stopped going out, missed social gatherings, and avoided phone calls. One friend described her as walking on eggshells, always careful not to say something that would trigger another outburst at home. Investigators later reviewed old text messages between her and a coworker where she confided, "He doesn't hit me, but he makes me feel small every day." It was around this time that Calvin's temper began surfacing in public too. Danielle told police about nights when arguments turned into shouting matches that left her in tears. "He'd say things just to break me down," she recalled in her written statement from the divorce records. "He'd laugh after and call it a joke, but it wasn't funny anymore." The final breaking point came in late 2021. Calvin allegedly showed up unannounced at her hospital after a night shift, demanding to talk because she hadn't returned a call. He caused such a scene that security had to escort him out. I remember her crying in the locker room, a nurse who worked with her told detectives. She just said, "I can't do this anymore." Within 2 weeks, Danielle filed for divorce. She didn't want alimony. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted freedom. The court finalized their divorce in February 2022. From that day forward, she focused on her children and her job. Post-divorce, Danielle was determined to rebuild. She rented a modest 2-bedroom apartment at first, then began saving for a home closer to the kids' school. Working double shifts wasn't easy, but she told a friend, "If I can just make it 1 year, I'll have my life back." Colleagues described her as hardworking and empathetic. Her supervisor at Eastmont Medical Center recalled, "She never complained. Even when she was exhausted, she showed up." Despite the long hours, Danielle seemed content. She had regained control over her life, at least on the surface. But even then, she was cautious. Those who knew her said she had become reserved, almost guarded. She was polite, but rarely opened up about her personal life. A neighbor recalled that she often smiled but didn't linger for conversations. She was friendly, but you could tell she was still healing, the neighbor said. To most people, Danielle was a devoted mother and a reliable nurse. But privately, she was still haunted by the fear of ever losing herself again. "I just want peace," she had told her sister during a phone call that police later referenced in their report. "That's all I want now. Just peace." Her friends said she didn't date, didn't go out much, and seemed determined to focus solely on her children. Every paycheck went toward paying off debt and saving for a small house in Eastmont, which she purchased in November 2022. For Danielle, that house represented independence, the first space that truly belonged to her. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a home where her kids could grow up free from shouting, where mornings began with laughter, not fear. But even in that newfound calm, traces of her old anxiety remained. Co-workers recalled her habit of checking her phone frequently, especially at night. She kept her social circle small, limited to a few colleagues and her sister. She never talked bad about Calvin, one of them told reporters. She just said it was over and that she was moving on. To the outside world, it looked like she had finally rebuilt what she lost: stability, safety, and confidence. But for investigators piecing together her story after the tragedy, one question remained. How could a woman who fought so hard for peace end up at the center of a crime that shattered it? The answer, they would soon discover, was hidden not in her present, but in the quiet scars she carried from her past. Just when Danielle thought she was done with men and their drama, life decided to test her again, but this time, in a way that felt different. During a local community fundraiser for the Children's Hospital in Eastmont, she met someone who would completely change the rhythm of her life. His name was Darius Pierce. At the time, he was a small business consultant known for his calm confidence and warm sense of humor. According to people who were there that evening, Darius struck up a conversation with Danielle while they were both helping organize medical supply donations. "You've got that nurse focus," he teased lightly, to which she smiled and said, "And you've got that salesman charm." From that moment, there was a spark, subtle but undeniable. Their first few interactions were casual, usually surrounded by people from the community. But Darius made an effort. He would stop by the hospital sometimes with coffee for the nurses or send small texts asking about her day. Danielle wasn't used to that kind of attention anymore. Gentle, consistent, and patient. Friends later said she talked about him with caution at first, describing him as someone who listens more than he talks. In one conversation with her sister, Danielle reportedly said, "He's not pushy. He doesn't make me feel like I owe him anything. It's just easy." For a woman who had spent years being controlled and questioned, that ease was exactly what she had been missing. Within a few months, Darius and Danielle started spending weekends together. He took her to brunch, attended her kids' school events when invited, and slowly became part of her daily routine. One of her co-workers recalled, "You could see her come back to life. She was laughing again. Her whole energy was lighter. Darius never rushed her into anything. He understood her situation, divorced, raising 2 kids, trying to find her footing, and instead of complicating her life, he made it simpler. He was respectful of her boundaries and her time. He used to say, "You've carried enough. Let someone else help for a while," one friend later remembered. Danielle's children liked him, especially her son, who bonded with Darius over video games. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that love didn't have to hurt. People who knew her during that time said she looked genuinely happy. Her close friend, Angela, later told investigators, she used to say, "I feel safe again," and I think she meant it. Darius, too, seemed completely taken by her. He introduced her to his parents during Thanksgiving, describing her as the woman I've been waiting for. Their relationship moved quickly, but to those around them, it didn't seem reckless. It felt right. They shared the same faith, the same work ethic, and the same dreams of stability. After just 6 months of dating, Darius proposed during a small dinner at Danielle's home. Her sister said she called that night crying tears of joy. "He asked in the most respectful way," Danielle had told her. "He didn't just ask me, he asked about my kids too." Friends described the proposal as intimate and sincere, not flashy or exaggerated. He gave her a modest diamond ring and told her, "It's not about how much it costs, it's about what we build with it." Their wedding took place a few weeks later at a church nearby, followed by a small celebration with close family and friends. Danielle wore a simple ivory dress, and her children walked her down the aisle. To everyone who attended, it felt like a new chapter for her. She was glowing, one guest recalled. It was like watching someone get their life back. Darius looked proud, constantly holding her hand, introducing her as "my wife," with a grin that seemed permanent. There were photos of them dancing, laughing, and cutting a small cake together. It wasn't extravagant, but it was full of emotion. Even after the wedding, Danielle stayed true to her boundaries. She and Darius didn't immediately move in together. She explained to friends that she wanted her kids to take their time adjusting. "I don't want to confuse them," she told Angela. "They've just started feeling secure again. I want to do this the right way." Darius agreed, telling her, "We've got forever, no rush." But what no one knew then was that within weeks, the peace she had worked so hard to protect would be shattered once again, and the very love that once made her feel safe would soon become the center of an investigation that no one could have predicted. It's one thing to love and want to protect the people you care about, but it becomes dangerous when that protection turns into possession. For Danielle, what started as attention soon began to feel like surveillance. Darius wanted constant updates about where she was, who she spoke to, and how long she stayed there. At first, she thought it was affection. He would text, "Just checking you're safe," or "I worry when I don't hear from you." But over time, the tone changed. "I called you twice," he'd write. "You had time to post online but not to answer me?" Danielle brushed it off as concern. "He's just protective," she told a coworker. "He likes to know I'm okay." But those close to her started seeing what she couldn't, or maybe refused to. Darius began showing up at her job unannounced, often standing near the nurse's station under the excuse of bringing her lunch. Her colleagues noticed how her demeanor shifted whenever he arrived. "She used to be bubbly," one coworker later told investigators. "Now she'd freeze when her phone buzzed." He started calling during her breaks, asking who she was with and how long she'd been away from her unit. Once, a nurse overheard him on speakerphone saying, "You don't need to talk to people about me. Keep our business between us." Danielle laughed it off, but the tension in her voice was hard to ignore. Another coworker said, "She kept defending him. She'd say, 'He's just trying to protect what's his.'" Those words stuck with investigators later. Darius also didn't like that Danielle still communicated with her ex-husband Calvin, even though it was only about their children. "I can be a dad to them too," he told her once, according to a close friend who she confided in. Danielle responded, "They already have one. You don't need to replace him." The disagreement never turned physical, but it left her emotionally exhausted. Yet she still believed things would get better if she reassured him enough. "He's been through a lot," she would say. "He just doesn't trust easily." Small arguments became daily occurrences. If she didn't answer a text quickly enough, Darius accused her of ignoring him. If she spent time with her children alone, he called it keeping secrets. Once during a dinner out, a waiter complimented her earrings, and Darius's expression shifted. "You didn't wear those when we met," he said quietly. "Who are you trying to impress?" Danielle laughed it off in front of the waiter, but later that night, she admitted to a friend, "It's like he watches for things that aren't even there." The same friend later told police, it wasn't fear in her voice. It was frustration mixed with confusion, like she was trying to make sense of who he'd become. By early March 2023, the changes in Danielle were clear to everyone who knew her. Her co-workers noticed she smiled less, stayed on her phone more, and often looked distracted. One of them asked, "You okay?" And she replied, "Yeah, just tired. You know how family life can be." But behind that short answer was growing tension she couldn't admit. She had started deleting messages, clearing call logs, and keeping conversations brief just to avoid conflict. "I'll call you when I can," she texted her sister one evening. "He's around, and I don't want to start something." It wasn't control in the form of shouting or threats. It was quiet, constant monitoring disguised as love. What made it more complicated was how Darius's control never looked dangerous from the outside. To friends and family, he was polite, generous, and affectionate. He attended church with her, brought flowers on birthdays, and volunteered at her kids' school events. To anyone watching, he was the perfect husband. But behind closed doors, every gesture came with an invisible cost: her freedom. She started walking on eggshells, one neighbor said later, like she was trying not to upset him without even realizing it. As weeks passed, the tension grew quietly but steadily. Danielle rarely visited friends without letting Darius know first, and when she did, he would call repeatedly until she answered. "You okay?" he'd ask, pretending to check on her safety, but the tone left no room for misunderstanding. When she once ignored his call during a staff meeting, he waited outside the hospital parking lot for her. "You could have just told me you were busy," he said calmly, handing her coffee as if nothing was wrong. She smiled politely, but her co-workers who witnessed it said the smile didn't reach her eyes. Even the smallest misunderstandings triggered tension. A delayed response, a canceled dinner, or a visit from Calvin, all of it set off new rounds of questioning. Yet Danielle continued convincing herself that things were fine. "Every relationship has challenges," she said during a late-night phone call with a friend. "He just needs time." That same week, she confided to another, "I love him. I just need him to trust me." But love wasn't supposed to feel like surveillance, and the more Darius tightened his grip on her life, the closer she unknowingly moved toward the point where everything would collapse. Was he being protective, or was it paranoia hiding behind devotion? No one knew then, but Danielle was about to reach a breaking point that would change every life connected to hers forever. March 16th, 2023, the day before everything fell apart, started with something small and ordinary. The heater in Danielle's home stopped working. The kids complained it was colder in the living room and asked if they could get extra blankets. Danielle called her usual repair number and left a message asking if someone could come by that afternoon. The tech texted back around noon, "Running behind. Family emergency. Can I reschedule for tomorrow?" She told the kids it would be fixed soon and put the issue to the side, but the house felt off all day. Small frustrations stacking into a thicker mood. She worried about missing work the next night if the heater stayed out, and quietly checked prices for a replacement just in case. It was the kind of inconvenience she'd handled before, but that day the little problem seemed heavier. She debated calling Darius to ask him to help, but stopped herself. She didn't want to start an argument over something practical. Earlier that week, their messages had been a mix of warmth and tension, and she knew bringing up a minor household issue could turn into a long conversation about trust and attention. Instead, she texted him a single line at 2:18 p.m. Heater acting up. Don't worry about it unless you want to. His reply came 20 minutes later. If you need me there, I can swing by. Don't freeze. At 4:03 p.m., his tone shifted in a short message. You didn't say who you called. Just tell me next time. The back and forth felt normal at first, small check-ins and short reassurances. But underneath it was a pattern that made her think twice before asking for help. Later that afternoon, the repairman called to explain. Danielle, I'm really sorry. My kid had a bad reaction and I had to take him to urgent care. I can be there first thing tomorrow, he said. Danielle replied, I understand. I hope he's okay. She hesitated before adding, It's just the kids are home tomorrow for teacher work day, so it'd be great if someone could stop by. The man promised again and apologized for the inconvenience. The call ended politely, but Danielle felt the pressure of a house that needed small fixes and the stress of balancing work and caretaking alone. That night, texts between Danielle and Darius were a study in quick shifts. At 7:12 p.m., she sent a photo of the kids coloring and a short message. They made me laugh today. Good night. He replied almost immediately. I love that for you. Sleep well, babe. By 9:48 p.m., a terse message arrived. You posted a photo with someone tagged. Why didn't you tell me you were with them? Danielle answered quickly. It was just a neighbor helping with a toy. Didn't think it mattered. His response read, Just say it next time. Those exchanges were not dramatic on their own, but over the week they had become a loop of warmth followed by questions, affection followed by demands for explanation. Alone on the couch after the kids were asleep, Danielle started searching for answers to a different set of worries. She typed into her phone, Georgia Self-Defense Law Home, and read several pages listing protections and legal phrases about defending oneself in the home. The language felt clinical and distant, but the headlines and summaries made her pause. She copied a line into a note app that night. Use of force allowed if defender reasonably believes deadly force is necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury. She didn't tell anyone she was reading those pages. In a voice message to a close friend she kept later, she said only, I was looking up some stuff, just covering my bases. Around 11:05 p.m., Danielle called her friend Angela and spoke in a low, steady tone meant to calm both of them. If he ever comes here again, she said, and Angela remembers the sentence exactly because Danielle then laughed nervously and added, I'll end it. Angela told detectives later that she never believed Danielle meant anything literal. She thought it was an expression of frustration. But she also said Danielle sounded tired and sharp that night. We both laughed it off, but I could hear how on edge she was. Angela told investigators. The call ended with the kind of reassurances friends give each other. You aren't alone. Call me if anything changes. Dawn broke on March 17th with small, ordinary sounds. Coffee pots, the kids getting ready for a day at home. But under that ordinary morning lay a thread of unease that hadn't been there a week earlier. Danielle moved through routines with a cautious efficiency, packing snacks, checking school messages, making a list of small chores. She hadn't told Calvin about the heater yet. It was a decision to avoid more complication. She also didn't know that by late morning a car would arrive at her driveway, and that a sequence of rapid events would turn a minor household issue and a strained relationship into a life-changing tragedy. The last quiet hour before everything changed closed like a held breath, and the day that had started with a missed repair call was about to demand answers no one had. The day began quietly, the kind of morning that doesn't hint at disaster. Danielle's focus was simple: get the heater fixed before the kids started complaining again. They'd already spent the previous night bundled up in blankets, and she couldn't stand hearing them shiver one more time. The repairman who'd promised to come never showed the day before. He'd sent an apologetic text about his child's emergency. Danielle didn't want to pressure him again. The other local technician her neighbor recommended hadn't returned her call either. She considered calling Darius, but their communication had been tense lately. He'd likely turn the situation into another long conversation, one she didn't have the energy for. So her mind went to the one person who always knew how to handle small fixes around the house, her ex-husband, Calvin Brooks. It wasn't about emotion or nostalgia. It was about necessity. She stared at his contact for a while before pressing call. When Calvin answered, she got straight to the point. "The heater's out again. The guy canceled yesterday," she said. "Could you help me fix it for the kids?" His response was short, but sure. "The kids are involved? I'll be there." By 9:10 a.m., his silver truck pulled into the driveway. Neighbors saw him walk up, toolbox in hand, calm as ever. He greeted the children with hugs, asked where the problem was, and got straight to work in the hallway. Danielle kept to herself, responding when needed, mostly letting him focus. At 10:37 a.m., Danielle opened her messages and typed a quick line. Just a courtesy update. "Calvin's here fixing the heater, just so you know." Then she put the phone down. There was no reply, no typing bubble, nothing. She shrugged it off and went back to sorting laundry. Around 10:50 a.m., the quiet routine of the neighborhood broke. A neighbor's door camera captured a black SUV racing into the cul-de-sac, stopping sharply in front of Danielle's house. The sound of the door slamming echoed across the street. "It was so loud it made my dog bark," one neighbor later told police. Then it just went silent. Inside the Pierce residence, the kids were still watching cartoons. Calvin was crouched by the hallway vent, and Danielle stood near the kitchen counter. No one expected a visitor, certainly not that early. What happened over the next few minutes would confuse investigators for months. Witnesses described different things. One said they heard shouting, voices overlapping, one of them angry. Another neighbor said it was eerily quiet right before the two shots. It wasn't like a struggle, she recalled. Just two quick pops, and then silence. At 11:17 a.m., multiple 911 calls came in. Shots fired at a residence on Ridgeview Drive. Officers from the county sheriff's office were dispatched within minutes. When they arrived, the scene was chaotic but strangely contained. The front door was open, the entryway disordered, and a man lay motionless inside. The first officer to enter immediately radioed for backup and medical assistance. The children were quickly moved to a neighbor's home for safety. What struck investigators first was the lack of any forced entry. The locks were intact, no windows broken. Whoever entered had either been let in or already had access. Detectives found a set of keys near the door and a cell phone on the floor. There were no signs of a robbery or an intruder's struggle, only signs of something personal. Paramedics worked to revive the man on the floor, but he was already gone. The first question for detectives was clear. Who was in the house at the time of the shooting? The report listed 3 names. 2 adults, 2 children. Each had a reason to be there. Each was accounted for. But who had pulled the trigger? That was less certain. By early afternoon, the investigation shifted into full motion. The street was blocked off, yellow tape surrounding the home. Crime scene technicians marked evidence, bagged items, and began photographing every corner of the entryway. 2 shell casings were recovered near the front door. Early ballistic analysis confirmed both rounds came from the same weapon, a 9mm handgun, but the firearm itself had not yet been linked to any individual at the scene. Detectives turned their attention to Calvin first. His presence that morning, his past history with Danielle's husband, and his proximity to the event made him the logical starting point. He didn't resist when officers asked him to come in for questioning. According to the report, he kept repeating one line during his transport. "I didn't even hear where it came from." At the station, Calvin recounted his version of events clearly. "I was fixing the heater. The kids were in the living room. I heard the door, heard voices. Then bang, bang, that's it. I didn't even move." Detectives asked if he had touched a weapon that day. "No," he said firmly. "Never owned one." Gun residue tests were conducted immediately. Hours later, the results came back negative. He had no traces of gunpowder on his hands or clothes. His alibi was consistent, and the kids confirmed he was working in the hallway when the shots rang out. That didn't mean the case was closed. Investigators still had unanswered questions. How had the shooter gained entry? Why had the confrontation turned deadly? And if not Calvin, then who else inside that home had the means and the motive to pull the trigger? Forensics continued late into the evening. The two bullets had traveled at close range, roughly 5 feet apart, hitting the victim in the upper body with precise grouping. That detail suggested a controlled discharge, not random fire. A single cell phone, later confirmed to belong to the victim, was found near his body. No weapon was discovered in his reach. But the question that puzzled detectives was, what had he reached for? By 9 p.m., Ridgeview Drive was quiet again. Police vehicles had left, leaving behind a home sealed under investigation. News of the shooting spread fast. Neighbors gathered on porches, whispering theories. Some said it was an intruder. Others said it had to be someone close. But no one agreed on who. Inside the precinct, detectives reviewed evidence and camera footage from nearby homes, trying to stitch together the timeline. One officer muttered as he went through the early reports. "It doesn't make sense. No break-in, no sign of struggle. Everyone says it was calm, then shots." Another replied quietly, "Sometimes the worst things happen in calm places." By the time dawn approached on March 18th, one fact was undeniable. This was no random act. Whoever fired those two shots was someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and someone who belonged in that house. But for now, the identity of the shooter remained locked behind silence and confusion. The official report that night ended with a single note that set the tone for everything that would follow. If it wasn't Calvin Brooks, then the truth is much closer than anyone realizes. Inasmuch as every effort was focused on finding out who fired the fatal shots, detectives also needed to understand who the victim truly was. They knew his name, Darius Pierce, 35 years old, and where he worked, a small business consulting firm downtown. But that was only the surface. They wanted to know what kind of man he was, what he was involved in, and what his life looked like in the weeks leading up to his death. Because in most cases, a person's digital footprint speaks louder than their friends or family ever could. The search warrant for his phone, laptop, and car GPS data was approved within 48 hours, and what investigators found started to paint a complicated picture, one that made the case even harder to define. The first red flag was a series of apps recovered from Darius's phone, including one that mirrored another device's location in real time. It was registered under Danielle's number. Detectives contacted the software company to verify the login records. The data showed that the app had been active for almost 2 months before the shooting. It wasn't something a stranger could set up accidentally. It required access to the phone and a verification code. When confronted with the findings, one of Darius's co-workers told police, "He mentioned once that he didn't like her texting her ex. He said he just wanted to make sure she was where she said she'd be." Another text exchange dated February 28th showed Darius writing, "If you need to talk to someone, talk to me, not him." Danielle's reply was short. "It's about the kids, Darius. That's it." Further into his call logs, investigators found late-night activity that lined up with Danielle's reports of being watched. Between March 10 and 15, Darius had called her over 20 times after midnight, sometimes letting the line ring for minutes without leaving a message. In one voicemail retrieved by technicians, Darius could be heard saying, "I don't like being ignored, Danielle. You promised me honesty." Another message came a few hours later. "Don't make me show up. Just pick up the phone." Detectives made note of his tone. Firm, not overtly violent, but filled with tension that hinted at control. But when investigators searched Danielle's phone, what they found complicated things even more. Alongside everyday conversations and work chats were messages exchanged with her ex-husband, Calvin. One in particular, dated March 13th, read, "He scares me sometimes." Another, sent the following day, said, "If he ever shows up again, I'll end it." Prosecutors would later point to that text as proof that the shooting wasn't an accident. Detectives, however, weren't immediately convinced. They debated internally whether the message was literal or just emotional venting between two people with a shared past. Still, it gave them a reason to consider motive. Was Danielle genuinely afraid, Or was she anticipating something she already planned to end? As detectives dug further, a pattern emerged in Darius's behavior. GPS records placed his vehicle in Danielle's neighborhood on multiple occasions, even on days when she said they weren't meeting. One of his colleagues confirmed he sometimes left the office early, saying he wanted to check on things at home. A digital forensic specialist reviewing his texts noted that several were deleted around March 16th, less than 24 hours before the shooting. The messages couldn't be fully recovered, but fragments indicated a rising argument. One read, "We'll talk tomorrow. You can't keep doing this." The final message sent from his phone was time-stamped 10:41 a.m. on the day of the shooting. While the evidence pointed to a controlling side of Darius, detectives couldn't ignore how. Some details pointed the other way. Danielle's search history, including multiple visits to websites explaining Georgia's stand-your-ground laws, raised eyebrows. Investigators wondered if those searches were a sign of preparation rather than fear. In one group discussion recorded in the case notes, a detective remarked, "You don't research the law on lethal force unless you're expecting to use it." But another detective countered, "Or unless you're scared enough to make sure you know your rights." The department itself was divided. Some believed the incident was a desperate act of protection. Others called it revenge fueled by frustration. As the case gained traction online, leaks from anonymous sources began circulating. Local outlets picked up details about texts suggesting premeditation, while others focused on Darius's history of jealousy and control. Social media turned it into a debate. Was Danielle a victim of psychological abuse, or a calculated manipulator hiding behind fear? Community opinion split sharply. Domestic violence advocates rallied behind her, while critics argued she'd crossed a line no law could justify. Then came new leads that forced detectives to step back. A neighbor came forward saying they'd seen a dark sedan idling near the corner minutes before the shots were fired. The car didn't match Darius's SUV. The witness described it as older, maybe a Toyota, but couldn't identify the driver. Investigators canvassed nearby streets for security cameras and pulled footage from a gas station 2 blocks away, but nothing showed a clear plate or face. Another possible lead emerged when one of Danielle's co-workers mentioned a man who'd once shown unhealthy interest in her at the hospital. He'd wait around after his appointments, the co-worker recalled. She even had to block him on social media. Detectives checked that angle too. The man was a former patient treated months earlier for a minor injury. He lived across town and had been at work the day of the shooting. Both the car and the former patient were ruled out, but the suspicion they introduced kept the investigation from narrowing too quickly. Every clue, every record, every testimony seemed to pull the case in opposite directions. One detective later summarized it in his report. Both the victim and the potential shooter appear to have acted out of fear, one of losing control, the other of being controlled. The challenge now was proving which fear led to those 2 bullets. By the end of the week, evidence analysts prepared their full report for the district attorney's office, but even then, no one could agree on what exactly happened inside that house. As one lead investigator said in an interview later, the scene told one story. The digital trail told another. When the district attorney reviewed the evidence, she authorized the case to move toward formal charges, but even she admitted that intent remains unclear. The only certainty was that someone inside that home had reached a breaking point, and that the answers weren't in fingerprints or shell casings, but in the complicated web of fear, control, and mistrust that bound every person connected to that house. The file closed that night with a note written in the corner of the detective's report. The case has truth on both sides. One's buried, the other's about to surface. Courtroom 4B, Fulton County Courthouse, September 17, 2023. The moment the trial began, the case that had already divided a community was now set to test the line between fear and guilt. Prosecutors came armed with evidence, timelines, and a clear conclusion: that Danielle Pierce had fired the weapon that killed her husband, Darius. There was no longer a question of who pulled the trigger. The 9mm handgun recovered from her porch railing was registered in her name, and the purchase receipt, found in her kitchen drawer, bore her signature from January 2023. The prosecution opened by stating, "This was not self-defense. This was a choice, and choices have consequences." For the next 7 days, the courtroom would hear two stories, one of survival and one of control. The state's lead prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Mark Ingram, started with the timeline. At 10:37 a.m., he said, holding up a printed copy of the text message, the defendant sent her husband a message stating that her ex was in the home. 30 minutes later, her husband lay dead by the front door. He paused, pacing before the jury. She didn't call the police. She didn't leave the house. She waited. And when he came, she shot him. The prosecution displayed enlarged photos of the weapon and ballistics reports. Both shots were fired from 5 feet away, directly at the chest. That, Ingram said, is not a panicked spray. That's precision. That's control. The defense objected immediately, arguing that emotional abuse had conditioned Danielle's reactions. Her attorney, Maria Hernandez, countered during opening statements. This case isn't about control. It's about fear, the kind that builds over time until it rewires your sense of safety. She called Danielle a mother who'd been pushed to her limit, responding to years of emotional manipulation. The judge, Honorable Carla Jeffries, instructed the jury to keep an open mind and reminded them that intent, not just action, would determine guilt. Witness testimony began with forensic experts. Ballistics confirmed the gun belonged to Danielle. Gun residue tests showed she fired the weapon at close range. But the defense pressed on intent. The angles of both shots matched the height difference between her and Darius, supporting a theory of reaction rather than premeditation. A forensic pathologist testified. Both bullets were fired in rapid succession, less than a second apart. To the defense, that detail mattered. It suggested reflex, not deliberation. Next came the digital evidence. Prosecutors presented Danielle's Google search from the night before. Georgia Stand Your Ground Law Home Defense. They called it a blueprint for what she did the following morning. Ingram turned to the jury and asked, "Who looks up the law on deadly force hours before using it?" Hernandez responded during cross-examination, "Who hasn't looked up their rights when they're scared?" The exchange drew murmurs across the courtroom. When the text messages between Danielle and Calvin were entered into evidence, the atmosphere changed. The words glowed on the large courtroom monitor. "He scares me sometimes. If he ever shows up again, I'll end it." The prosecutor lingered on the second line. "Ladies and gentlemen, those are her words. Days before the shooting, she didn't say she'd call the police. She said she'd end it." But the defense argued that emotional language should never be taken literally in domestic situations. Hernandez addressed the jury directly. People in pain say things they don't mean all the time. Fear doesn't always sound polite. Sometimes it sounds like frustration. One of the most emotional moments came when Calvin Brooks took the stand. He didn't want to testify, but his subpoena left no choice. His voice stayed steady, though his eyes rarely lifted from the table. "Darius wasn't easy to deal with," he said quietly. "He loved Danielle, but he wanted things his way. He didn't like that I was still around for the kids." The prosecutor asked, "Did you ever feel threatened by Mr. Pierce?" Calvin hesitated, then replied, "Not directly. But I could see how controlling he was with her. It reminded me of who I used to be before we ended things." That statement hit the room hard, a rare moment of self-awareness that made even the jury pause. The defense called their expert witness next, psychologist Dr. Elaine Myers, a trauma specialist who had reviewed Danielle's interviews and behavior patterns. She explained how victims of emotional control often remain hyper-alert, unable to distinguish between potential danger and real threat. "When someone's brain has lived in survival mode long enough," Dr. Myers said, "it doesn't wait to verify. It reacts to stay alive." The prosecution pressed her on cross, asking, "Are you saying she couldn't tell right from wrong?" Dr. Myers answered calmly, "I'm saying she couldn't tell safety from danger." On the fourth day, Danielle took the stand. Her voice cracked when she described her life with Darius. "He wanted updates all the time. Where I was, who I was with, why I didn't answer fast enough. She admitted to searching self-defense laws, but insisted it wasn't about planning violence. I just wanted to know if I had rights in my own home, she said. When asked what happened, that morning, she said, he came in angry. He yelled. The kids screamed. I thought he was reaching for something. Her hands shook as she added, I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted him to stop. Closing arguments came after a week of testimony that left everyone divided. The prosecution emphasized the calmness of her actions, the deliberate aim, the timing, the research, the text messages. This was pride and control disguised as fear, Ingram said. She couldn't handle being challenged, so she made sure she wouldn't be again. The defense responded with a final plea to empathy. Every bruise isn't physical, Hernandez told the jury. Sometimes it's the years of being watched, questioned, and blamed. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like pulling the trigger before the past pulls you down again. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. No one in the courtroom spoke when they returned. The clerk read the verdict aloud. On the charge of second-degree murder, not guilty. On the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter, guilty. A low murmur swept across the room. Danielle stood motionless, eyes wide, before covering her face. When the judge asked if she wished to speak before sentencing, her words came out soft but heavy. I thought I was protecting my kids. I didn't know I'd destroy them too. Judge Jeffries sentenced her to 12 years in state prison, eligible for parole after 8. As deputies led her out, Calvin stayed seated, hands clasped, staring at the floor. The courtroom emptied slowly, the sound of quiet conversations replacing the noise of argument. Outside, reporters gathered as evening settled in, the story already spreading across the nation. But for those who had sat through every minute, the jurors, the families, the lawyers, one question lingered in the air. Was Danielle Pierce a victim of control, or had she simply become the thing she feared most? The file on her case was officially marked closed, but everyone who had heard it knew that closure was something no one would be taking home that night. Danielle Pierce began serving her 12-year sentence at the Pulaski State Prison in Georgia on May 9, 2023. She would be eligible for parole after 8. Court transcripts show that her final words before sentencing stayed with everyone present. I thought I was protecting my kids. I didn't know I'd destroy them too. In the weeks following the verdict, news stations replayed clips from the trial alongside endless debates. Was justice truly served? Or was a woman being punished for surviving the very fear that had consumed her life? The case became a flashpoint for advocacy groups across the country. Some called Danielle's sentence fair and measured. Others saw it as another example of how emotional abuse is misunderstood by the legal system. Domestic violence advocates in Atlanta argued that emotional trauma can alter perception as deeply as physical harm. One advocate, Lisa Harmon from the Georgia Coalition for Victim Support, said in an interview, "We have laws that protect against bruises you can see. But what about the kind that you can't?" On talk shows and podcasts, lawyers dissected every piece of evidence: the text messages, the search history, the gun. Some called it premeditation. Others labeled it a reflex born of fear. For weeks, Danielle's name trended on social media. Some users defended her, saying she did what she thought she had to do. Others were less forgiving. You don't shoot someone twice and call it fear. The court of public opinion had no verdict, only opinions that cut both ways. Meanwhile, Calvin Brooks quietly took custody of their 2 children. He avoided interviews and public appearances. His attorney released a brief statement to the press. Mr. Brooks's only concern is the well-being of his children. He will not be participating in further media coverage. Those who knew him said he had changed after the case. Quieter, more reflective, careful with every word. Teachers at the children's school noticed their behavior shifting. The younger ones startled at loud noises. The older became withdrawn, often sitting alone during recess. They're polite, but they carry sadness, one teacher told reporters. It's like they're still waiting for something to go back to normal. Friends of Danielle described a woman who never wanted chaos, only calm. Her close friend Angela, who testified during the trial, said later, "All she ever talked about was peace, not money, not marriage, just peace." In prison interviews conducted months after sentencing, Danielle maintained that she had never meant to kill anyone. "If I could go back, I'd walk away," she said. "But when someone makes you feel unsafe for long enough, you start to see danger in every shadow." She now works as a nursing aide inside the prison infirmary, spending her days caring for other inmates. Some officers describe her as quiet and cooperative, but still emotionally distant. She doesn't talk much about the shooting, only about her children. "Tell them I still love them," she once told a visiting counselor. The community where it all happened remains divided. Some neighbors still refuse to pass by the old house on Ridgeview Drive. Others insist that Danielle's punishment was too severe, calling her a victim of circumstance. A few believe she got away lightly. Over time, the story shifted from a local tragedy to a national conversation about how the law defines fear. Should fear justify fatal action, or does accountability have to stand, even when emotions run high? One columnist in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote, "It's easy to judge someone's decisions when you've never lived inside their panic. Years passed, the headlines faded, the cameras left. But for the people who were there, the questions never stopped." Some of the jurors agreed to speak publicly after the case's closure. One juror, whose interview aired on a local true crime special, summed up the conflict perfectly. "We couldn't decide if she was terrified or tired, maybe both." Another added, "It felt like no matter what verdict we gave, someone innocent was still going to suffer. The house where it all happened has long since been repainted. A new family moved in, unaware at first of what had taken place within its walls." The neighborhood returned to its routines. The sound of children playing outside replaced the echo of police sirens. But for those who knew the story, that house wasn't just a building. It was a reminder of how love can turn into fear, and fear into tragedy. A reminder that sometimes the danger we think we're keeping out is already inside. In one of the closing reports filed by investigators, a detective wrote, "She thought she ended the threat, but fear doesn't die, even after the trigger's been pulled." That single line outlived every other detail in the file. It became the quiet conclusion that no one wanted to admit, that fear, once rooted deep enough, doesn't disappear. It mutates, lingers, and waits. The story of Danielle Pierce isn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It's about what happens when love, control, and fear live under the same roof. It's about how survival can be mistaken for revenge, and how the line between protection and destruction can blur without warning. Behind every headline is a heartbeat. Behind every case file is a story of someone trying to hold their world together. Danielle's story may be over in the courtroom, but its question still remains. What would you have done if you believed danger lived in your own home? If you found this story powerful, subscribe to our channel for more true cases that challenge what we think we know about justice, love, and survival. Like this video, share it, and join the discussion below. Because sometimes the truth doesn't end with a verdict. It begins with the question no one wants to answer.